The evening rush was just beginning to settle into a steady, manageable rhythm at the small Italian restaurant tucked away on a quiet side street. The air, thick with the comforting warmth of garlic bread and simmering tomato sauce, clung to the worn wooden beams of the ceiling. For the young woman working the floor, this was the time of night when her body moved on autopilot, a well-oiled machine of trays, orders, and polite smiles. She was in her late 20s, with a quietness about her that made her seem like part of the restaurant's faded furniture. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple, practical ponytail, and her apron, a clean but frayed white, was tied neatly at her waist. She moved between the tables with a practiced grace, her footsteps silent on the old linoleum. A family of 4 laughed loudly over a basket of breadsticks, and she refilled their water glasses without breaking their conversation. A young couple on a first date sat in awkward silence, and she placed their steaming plates of pasta down with a gentle, "Enjoy your meal." That was just enough to fill the void without intruding. They barely looked at her. To them, she was just the waitress, a fleeting presence in the background of their lives. They didn't see the way her eyes, a soft and thoughtful brown, would sometimes lose focus for a second, drifting towards the corner of the room as if listening to a song no one else could hear. In that corner, standing like a silent, forgotten king, was an old, upright piano. Its wood was darkened with age, and the finish was scarred with the rings of countless glasses and the faint scratches of 100,000 moving chairs. It wasn't there for decoration. It was played every weekend by an elderly man who had been teaching music in the town for 50 years. But on a Tuesday night like this, it was just a large, silent object collecting dust and the low, golden light from the flickering candle on its lid. Her section included the tables near the piano, which she both cherished and dreaded. As she cleared a table, wiping away the crumbs with a damp cloth, her work brought her close to the instrument. The smell of old wood and lemon polish mingled with the scent of the restaurant. Her movements slowed, her efficiency melting away. She ran the cloth over the piano's lid, her touch becoming gentler, more caressing than cleaning. She wasn't just wiping a surface. She was greeting an old friend. Her fingers, which moments ago were adeptly balancing heavy plates and crumpling receipts, now hesitated above the keys. They were stained a little red from the sauce she'd spilled earlier, and a small bandage covered a tiny burn from the pizza oven. They looked like the hands of a hard-working waitress, not a musician. But as they hovered over the yellowed ivory, they seemed to remember a different life. A part of her that fell asleep most of the time began to stir. She could almost feel the familiar weight of the keys beneath her fingertips. The cool, smooth surface that promised so much. She remembered being a little girl, her feet not even reaching the pedals, her small hands stretching to form a chord. She remembered the feeling of triumph when her fingers finally learned to dance across the keys, turning the black dots on a page into something alive and breathing. Music had been her language, the one place where she didn't have to be quiet or shy. It was how she spoke when words failed her. She could pour all her unspoken feelings, her secret joys, and her deepest fears into the melodies, and the piano would understand. A loud laugh from the bar snapped her back to the present. The restaurant was still the same. The clatter of cutlery, the low hum of dozens of conversations, the hiss from the kitchen, it all came rushing back. The ghost of a smile that had been playing on her lips vanished, replaced by the neutral, pleasant expression she wore for work. She pulled her hand back as if the keys were hot, and quickly finished wiping the last of the crumbs from the piano's bench. She straightened up, her shoulders, which always seemed to carry a little extra weight, settling back into their familiar, tired posture. The dream was over, and it was time to get back to reality. She had 3 tables that needed their checks, and a new party of 4 had just been seated in her section. She took a deep breath, the air thick with the smells of her job, and turned away from the piano. As she walked towards the kitchen, she didn't look back. But the image of the keys remained imprinted on her mind, a silent, waiting invitation. It was a secret she kept from the world, a beautiful, aching part of her that was hidden away, just waiting for a chance to be heard. For now, the only song she was allowed to sing was the quiet, steady rhythm of her work. Saturday nights in the little Italian restaurant were a different beast entirely. The air didn't just smell of garlic and bread. It vibrated with a kind of happy, chaotic energy. Every table was full, the wait time for a walk-in was over an hour, and the noise level was a constant, cheerful roar. But cutting through it all, like a silver thread in a tangled tapestry, was the sound of the piano. The old man, a fixture in the town for as long as anyone could remember, sat on his worn bench, his fingers moving with a gentle, practiced certainty. He played old songs people knew in their bones, and his music acted as the heart of the room. Keeping its frantic rhythm in check, the young waitress moved through the crowd like a fish through a current. Her steps were quicker, her smile a little more practiced than on a quiet weeknight. She balanced a tray laden with steaming plates of fettuccine Alfredo and a basket of garlic knots, her movements fluid and sure. As she weaved between the tables, her ears were always tuned to the music. It wasn't a conscious effort. It was as natural as breathing. The music was a comfort, a familiar friend that made the hard work feel a little less like work. She saw how people reacted to it. A couple in the corner, holding hands over their checkered tablecloth, swayed gently to a romantic tune. A family with boisterous children seemed to calm down a little when a softer melody began to play. The music was magic, and she was just one of its many grateful admirers. She was clearing a table near the piano when she noticed it. It was a tiny thing, a single note that was just a little off, a sour grain of sand in the sweet music. Most people wouldn't have even caught it, but she did. Her head snapped up from the crumbs she was brushing onto a small plate. She looked at the old man. His smile, which was usually as constant as his playing, had tightened. His shoulders, which were usually relaxed, seemed hunched. He played another few bars, but the flow was gone. The music was now hesitant, stumbling. Then came the wrong note, loud and jarring this time. It was a crash in the middle of a quiet conversation. A few diners looked up, their faces showing a flicker of confusion. The waitress froze, her hand holding a dirty plate suspended in mid-air. She saw the man's left hand leave the keyboard and press against his chest, right over his heart. His face, which had been rosy from the warm lights, was suddenly pale, waxy. His other hand, the one that had been dancing on the keys, was now gripping the edge of the piano bench, his knuckles white. For a moment, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The music had stopped completely. The silence that rushed in to fill the space was sharp and unnerving. It was the silence of a broken thing. "Are you okay?" She heard herself ask, her voice barely a whisper. The old man didn't answer. He tried to say something, but only a small gasp came out. His eyes were wide with a look of fear and confusion. Then he slumped sideways, his body sliding off the bench and onto the floor with a heavy thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. That sound broke the spell. Chaos erupted. A woman at a nearby table screamed. The young waitress dropped her plate, which shattered on the floor, but she didn't even notice. She was already moving, rushing to the man's side, dropping to her knees beside him. The owner, a kind but perpetually stressed man named Sal, came running from the kitchen, his face a mask of panic. Someone was yelling for someone to call 911. The happy, energetic atmosphere of the restaurant had evaporated in an instant. Replaced by a scene of raw, terrifying reality, she knelt there, her hand on the man's shoulder, talking to him in a low, calm voice. Though she wasn't sure if he could hear her, she checked for a pulse, her fingers fumbling on his wrist. It was faint, a tiny, frantic fluttering against her skin. She looked up at Sal, who was hovering over them, his face pale. "He's breathing," she said. "But we need an ambulance, now." The next few minutes were a blur of flashing red and white lights that painted the dining room in straubing colors. Paramedics rushed in with a stretcher and a medical bag, their voices calm and professional as they took over. They asked questions and she answered them as best she could. She watched as they carefully lifted the old man onto the gurney, his small frame looking even smaller and more fragile surrounded by all the equipment. Sal followed them out, climbing into the back of the ambulance as it sped away into the night. And then they were gone. The restaurant was left in a state of shock. The diners spoke in hushed, worried tones. Some were already gathering their things, their evening ruined. The staff stood around, not sure what to do. Sal came back in a few minutes later, his face grim. He told them the old man was stable, but they were taking him to the hospital. Then he just stood there in the middle of his restaurant, looking lost. The silence was the worst part. The piano, which had been the heart of the room, was now just a large, empty wooden box. Its bench was pushed to the side, the lid open, revealing the rows of black and white keys that were now still and lifeless. The absence of music was a physical presence. The clatter of cutlery, the hum of the refrigerators, the low murmur of the customers, it all sounded harsh, ugly, and painfully loud without the gentle melodies to soften the edges. It was like a beautiful painting that had had all its color drained away, leaving only a dull, gray sketch. Sal began to pace, running his hands through his hair. He went from table to table, apologizing, explaining, looking completely defeated. A few customers were sympathetic, but others were clearly annoyed. They had come for the music, for the full experience, and now it was gone. The young waitress watched him from the doorway to the kitchen, a dirty dish towel clutched in her hand. She felt a deep ache in her chest, a worry for the kind old pianist who had always given her a small, knowing nod whenever she passed his corner. But there was something else, too. Her eyes kept drifting back to the silent piano. It looked so lonely. It sat there, open and waiting, like a mouth that had forgotten how to speak. She felt a strange pull towards it, a magnetic attraction that she couldn't explain. It was more than just a feeling of pity for an inanimate object. It was as if the silence of the piano was echoing a silence deep inside her. It was her own silence, her own hidden talent, sitting there exposed and empty for the whole world to see. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to go to it, to sit on that bench, and to let it speak again. But her feet felt rooted to the spot. The restaurant was slowly emptying out, the happy energy of the evening completely gone, replaced by a quiet, awkward disappointment. The problem was real and immediate, hanging in the air as thick as the scent of unused garlic bread. And she was the only one in the room who seemed to feel the weight of the silence as a personal, profound loss. The minutes after the ambulance left stretched into a long, uncomfortable hour. The restaurant, once a bustling hub of warmth and music, now felt hollow and cold. The few remaining customers spoke in whispers, their forks scraping against their plates with an unnerving loudness. The owner, a man whose face usually wore a look of friendly exhaustion, now just looked defeated. He moved from table to table, murmuring apologies. His shoulders slumped as if he were carrying the weight of the silent piano on his back. One by one, parties paid their bills and left, the little bell above the door chiming a sad, final note each time. The staff began the slow, somber process of cleaning up, wiping down tables that still felt full of the night's shattered expectations. The young waitress stood by the kitchen doorway, a dishcloth in her hand, her eyes fixed on the empty corner. The silence was a physical weight, pressing down on everything. It felt wrong, like a picture frame with the picture missing. In a quiet booth near the window, an elderly woman who had been a regular for years slowly finished her tea. She had seen everything, her sharp eyes missing none of the drama. She watched the owner pace and the waitress stare at the piano with a look that was more than just pity. It was a look of deep, personal understanding. As the owner passed her table, looking like he was about to give up and just close for the night, she put a gentle hand on his arm. "It's a shame about the music," she said, her voice soft but clear. "It's what makes this place special." The owner just nodded, too tired to speak. The woman's gaze then drifted to the waitress, who was now mechanically wiping down a nearby table. "You know," the old woman said, her voice carrying across the quiet space, "I've always noticed the way you look at that piano. You look at it like it's a person you miss." The waitress froze, her hand stopping mid-wipe. A blush crept up her neck, hot and unwelcome. "Can you even play, dear?" the woman asked, her tone full of genuine curiosity, not accusation. The question hung in the air, sharp and sudden. Every head in the near-empty restaurant turned to look at her. The owner stopped pacing. The dishwasher peeked out from the kitchen. All eyes were on her. She felt like a spotlight had been switched on, illuminating a part of her she had kept carefully hidden in the shadows for years. Her first instinct was to run. She shook her head quickly, a little too forcefully. "Oh no," she stammered, her voice barely a squeak. I just think it's a beautiful instrument." She turned away, pretending to be very busy with a crumb on the table, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But the owner, hearing the old woman's question, saw a glimmer of hope in the darkness of his ruined evening. He walked over to her, his expression a mixture of desperation and pleading. "Look," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I know it's a lot to ask. And I know you're not a performer, but these people, they came for the music. The night feels so broken." He gestured to the few tables that were still occupied. "Just a song or two. Anything to fill the quiet? I'll pay you for it, of course. I'll pay you double what you'd make in tips for the rest of the night." The offer of money barely registered. Her mind was a battlefield. One part of her was screaming, "No! Don't you dare! They'll laugh. You're just a waitress. You'll embarrass yourself." It was the voice of doubt, the voice that had kept her talent locked away for so long, telling her she wasn't good enough, that her dreams were foolish. She imagined her fingers fumbling on the keys, playing a wrong note, and the sound of polite, pitying applause. The thought was humiliating, but another voice, a quieter but more persistent one, was whispering, "The piano is waiting. It needs you. The music is inside you, and it wants to come out." She thought of the old man, his kind eyes, the way he nodded at her as if he knew her secret. She thought of the silence, how it felt like a wound in the heart of the restaurant, a wound she had the power to heal. The music wasn't just a hobby for her. It was a part of her soul. To leave that piano silent tonight felt like a betrayal, not just to the owner or the remaining customers, but to herself. She looked at the owner's tired face, at the old woman's encouraging smile, at the expectant faces of the few diners who were left. They weren't a hostile crowd. They were just people who had lost something beautiful and were hoping to find it again. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but now it was mixed with something else, a sense of purpose. The pull towards the piano was stronger than her fear of falling. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the slightest movement, but it changed everything in the room. The owner's face broke into a look of immense relief. The old woman smiled warmly. The waitress felt a strange sense of calm wash over her, the decision having been made. There was no turning back now. She slowly untied her apron, the white fabric feeling heavy and familiar as she folded it and placed it on a nearby chair. It felt like she was shedding one skin and preparing to reveal another. The walk to the piano was the longest of her life. The short distance from the kitchen doorway to the corner of the dining room felt like a mile. With every step, she was aware of the eyes on her, the complete and utter silence that had fallen over the room. She could hear the soft squeak of her shoes on the floor, the gentle hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. She kept her eyes fixed on the bench. Not daring to look at anyone, she reached the piano and ran her hand lightly over the smooth, dark wood, just as she had done 100 times before. But this time was different. This time she was going to answer its call. She sat down on the worn bench, its familiar coolness a small comfort. She wiggled her fingers, which felt stiff and foreign. For a moment she just sat there, her back to the room, looking at the rows of black and white keys. They were no longer just objects of her secret longing. They were her responsibility. The world outside the piano seemed to fade away. The expectations of the crowd, the fear of judgment, all of it disappearing until there was only her and the 88 keys waiting for her touch. She lifted her hands, her fingers hovering over the ivory, trembling slightly. She closed her eyes for a second, took one last breath, and then let her fingers fall. They landed on a single, simple chord in the middle of the keyboard. The note that rang out was not tentative or weak. It was clear, resonant, and flawlessly in tune, cutting through the heavy silence like a beam of light. It hung in the air, pure and perfect, a question and an answer all at once. and in that single sound the entire room understood. The waitress was gone. In her place sat a musician. That single, clear chord seemed to absorb all the noise in the room, sucking the clatter of cutlery and the low murmur of conversation into a void of pure sound. It hung in the air for a breathtaking moment, a perfect, shimmering question. Then her fingers, which had been hesitant for so long, began to move with a quiet confidence that surprised even herself. They found the opening notes of a melody, a gentle, flowing piece that felt like water moving over smooth stones. It was a piece by Debussy, Clair de Lune, a song of moonlight and quiet longing. The music didn't burst forth. It seeped out of the piano, filling the empty spaces in the air, and, in the hearts of everyone listening, the transformation in the room was immediate and profound. The few remaining diners who had been shifting in their seats, checking their phones, and whispering about the night's strange events, fell completely silent. A man in an expensive suit who had been typing angrily into his phone stopped mid-sentence. His thumb hovered over the screen, then slowly lowered the device to the table, his eyes now fixed on the quiet woman at the piano. The music was a language that didn't require words, and it was speaking directly to something deep inside him. For the waitress, the world outside the piano had simply ceased to exist. She was no longer in a restaurant, no longer a waitress. She was a child again, sitting on a worn bench in her parents' living room, the afternoon sun lighting up the dust motes dancing in the air. Her fingers, which had felt clumsy and foreign just moments before, now remembered everything. They remembered the hours of practice, the frustration of a difficult passage, the joy of finally getting it right. But they also remembered the feelings she had poured into the music back then, the feelings she had kept locked away for so many years. As the melody grew, it began to tell a story. It was the story of her own quiet life. The soft opening notes were her loneliness, the feeling of being invisible in a crowded room. The gentle, rising phrases were her secret hopes, the dreams she nurtured in the quiet moments after her shift ended, when she would listen to old recordings and imagine her hands on the keys. The music swelled, becoming more complex and emotional, and it was the sound of all the unspoken words she had ever wanted to say, all the emotions she had never felt free to show. She wasn't just playing the notes on the page. She was playing her soul. The owner stood near the kitchen, a dish towel still in his hand. He watched her, his mouth slightly agape. He had hired her because she was reliable and quiet, a good worker who didn't cause any trouble. He had never seen this person before. He saw the way her body swayed slightly with the music, her eyes closed in concentration, a faint, peaceful smile on her lips. He realized he didn't know his employee at all. He was seeing her true self for the first time, and it was a beautiful, humbling sight. The elderly woman who had encouraged her sat up straighter in her booth, a look of deep, knowing satisfaction on her face. She watched the other patrons, a silent conductor of the room's emotional orchestra. She saw the young couple on their first date, who had been sitting in an awkward silence. Now they were leaning towards each other, their eyes locked, not on each other, but on the shared experience of the music. The boy slowly reached across the table and took the girl's hand. She didn't pull away. They didn't need to talk. The music was saying everything for them. The melody of Clair de Lune continued to unfold, a river of sound that flowed through the restaurant. It was a sad song, but a beautiful kind of sad, the kind that makes you feel less alone in your own sorrow. The businessman in the expensive suit, the one who had been on his phone, was no longer looking at the piano. He was staring out the window, his reflection a faint outline on the dark glass. A single tear escaped his eye and traced a slow path down his weathered cheek. The music was reminding him of something or someone he had long tried to forget. A promise he had broken, a path he had not taken. The music was unlocking a part of his heart that he had kept. Under lock and key for years, even the staff from the kitchen had stopped working. 2 cooks and a dishwasher were pressed against the small serving window, their faces illuminated by the warm kitchen light. They had seen this woman every day, rushing in and out, dropping off orders, picking up plates. They had shared jokes with her, complained about the heat with her. But they had never seen this. They were witnessing a miracle. A transformation happening right before their eyes, the music reached its climax. A wave of sound that was both powerful and delicate. It was the sound of a heart breaking and healing all at once. It filled every corner of the room, washing over everyone, pulling them into its emotional current. There was no sound in the restaurant except for the piano. No one coughed, no one shifted in their seat, no one dared to break the spell. It was as if the entire world had paused to listen to this one, quiet woman share her hidden gift. Then, as gently as it had begun, the music started to recede. The notes became softer, more spaced out like the last echoes of a dream. She played the final, haunting chords, her touch so light it was as if she was afraid the sound might shatter. The last note hung in the air for a long moment, a single, shimmering thread of sound, before it too faded into silence. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It wasn't an empty or awkward silence. It was a full, heavy, sacred silence. It was the silence that comes after a profound experience, a moment of shared humanity that no one wanted to be the first to break. The waitress kept her hands on the keys, her head bowed, her eyes still closed. She was slowly coming back to the present, back to the reality of the restaurant, the feel of the worn bench beneath her, the sight of the flickering candle on the piano. She took a deep, shaky breath, the sound of it loud in the quiet room. The spell was broken, but its magic lingered in the air, thick and palpable. The silence that followed the last note was a living thing. It was thick and heavy, filled with the echoes of the melody that had just died away. The young woman kept her hands resting on the keys, her head bowed, her eyes squeezed shut as if she could hold on to the music just by thinking about it. She could feel the air in the room change, could feel the weight of every person's gaze on her small, hunched shoulders. A wave of cold panic washed over her, extinguishing the warm glow of the performance. What had she just done? She had stepped out of the shadows, exposed the most secret part of herself to a room full of strangers. The fear of judgment, which had been so quiet while she played, now came roaring back. She imagined them all staring, not with awe, but with pity or, even worse, with indifference. She felt a desperate urge to run, to hide, to put her apron back on and become invisible again. Then it started. It wasn't a loud, explosive applause. It was a single person clapping. Slow, deliberate, and respectful. It was the elderly woman in the booth. The sound of her two hands coming together was like a single drop of rain in a silent forest. Then another person joined in. The businessman in the expensive suit, his face still wet, began to clap, his movements stiff and emotional. Soon, the whole room was filled with the sound. It wasn't the polite, obligatory clapping people give after a forced performance. It was a deep, rolling wave of heartfelt appreciation. It was the sound of people who had been touched, who had been taken on a journey and were now grateful to their guide. The applause grew louder, filling the small restaurant, bouncing off the walls and the ceiling, a thunderous, beautiful roar that was for her and her alone. She flinched at the sound, her head snapping up. Her eyes, wide with shock, scanned the room. She saw faces that were not judgmental, but filled with emotion. She saw the young couple, the girl crying softly on the boy's shoulder. She saw the cooks, still pressed against the kitchen window, their faces beaming. She saw the owner, standing motionless, his own eyes glistening. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in. They weren't clapping out of pity. They had truly heard her. A blush, hot and overwhelming, flooded her cheeks. She quickly stood up from the bench, bumping her knee on the side of the piano. She stumbled back, shaking her head, her hands held up as if to ward off the sound. She wasn't a performer who knew how to accept praise. She was just a waitress who had played a song. She turned to flee back to the safety of the kitchen, but the owner was already moving towards her. He walked slowly, as if approaching a wild bird that might startle and fly away. The applause began to die down as people watched him. He stopped in front of her, his usual expression of friendly stress replaced by one of profound awe and respect. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the very first time. I had no idea, he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of his that was usually filled with frustration, but this time it was one of sheer disbelief. All this time, you had that inside you? She just stood there, wringing her hands, unable to meet his gaze. I'm sorry, she whispered, the first words she had spoken since sitting down. I didn't mean to cause a scene. He let out a short, soft laugh. A scene? Young lady, you didn't cause a scene. You healed one. He took a small step closer. Look, I don't know how to say this, so I'm just going to say it. The old man. He's going to need a long time to recover. And even if he comes back, he won't be able to play like he used to? He paused, taking a deep breath. I need music in this place. And not just any music. I need your music. I want you to play here. Every weekend. I'll pay you, of course. A proper musician's wage. Not just waitress pay? You can still help out during the rush if you want, but your job, your real job, will be that piano. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. The words didn't seem to make sense. A job? To play the piano? The thing she loved most in the world, the thing she had only ever done in secret, was being offered to her as a reality. It was too much, too good to be true. The fear and doubt, which had been momentarily silenced by the applause, started to creep back in. But I'm not a real musician, she stammered. I play for fun? The owner smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. Honey, what you just did in there, that wasn't for fun, that was real. That was the most real thing I've ever heard in this restaurant. He gestured around the room at the patrons who were still watching them. Just look at them. You did that. You gave them that. As if on cue, the elderly woman walked over. She didn't say anything to the owner. She just looked at the young waitress, her eyes shining with tears. She reached out and gently touched the girl's arm. Thank you, dear, she said softly. That was a gift. Then she turned and walked out of the restaurant. Leaving the scent of her perfume and a feeling of quiet grace in her wake, the businessman approached next. He straightened his tie, looking a little embarrassed. I don't mean to bother you, he said, his voice much softer than it had been earlier on the phone. I just wanted to say, I haven't thought about my wife in years without it hurting. Tonight, for the first time, I remembered her smile. Your music? It reminded me of the good parts. So, thank you. He gave her a small, grateful nod and then left, leaving her standing there. Stunned, the weight of their words, the sincerity in their eyes, began to chip away at the wall of fear she had built around herself for so long. This wasn't just about playing the piano anymore. It was about connection. It was about using this hidden part of herself to reach out to other people, to heal their wounds just as music had always healed hers. She looked back at the owner, a new determination in her eyes. The fear was still there, a small, trembling thing in the pit of her stomach, but it was no longer in control. Okay, she said, her voice still quiet but now steady. Okay, I'll do it. The owner's face broke into a wide, relieved grin. He clapped his hands together softly. Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. That night as she walked home, the world seemed different. The streetlights didn't just illuminate the pavement. They seemed to be shining a spotlight on her path forward. The cool night air didn't just feel cold. It felt crisp and new, like the first page of a new book. She thought about the old man in the hospital, and she sent a silent prayer for his recovery. She thought about the owner's kind offer, the elderly woman's gentle touch, and the businessman's heartfelt words. And she thought about the music. The music was no longer a secret to be hidden away. It was a part of who she was, a part she was finally ready to share with the world, the next weekend. A small, hand-painted sign appeared outside the little Italian restaurant. It simply read, Live music, Friday and Saturday evenings. There was no fancy name, no picture of a famous pianist. It didn't need one. Inside, the restaurant was bustling once again. The young woman still wore an apron and helped clear tables during the dinner rush. But as the evening began to settle, she would take off her apron, walk to the corner, and sit at the old upright piano. She would place her fingers on the keys and the room would fall silent. She was no longer just a waitress with a hidden talent. She was the restaurant's musician, the quiet songbird whose voice was finally, beautifully free.